Hello, welcome back. I am very happy to see you again. Thank you for sticking around. This video is going to be about Cosmopolitan magazine and their history. Now, if you've been watching my previous videos, you know that I kind of started off with Playboy magazine, and from Playboy jumped to Playgirl magazine, and from Playgirl I learned a lot about Cosmopolitan. So I really want to talk about why I think the history is so interesting, and also how it contributed to a lot of the magazines and content we see today that are aimed towards women. Now, I was able to buy an October 1971 issue of Cosmopolitan, but because these issues from the 70s and 80s of Cosmo were actually around $40 each on eBay, I was unable to buy one in better condition. So this one has a front cover, the back cover is separated, and I believe there's a few pages missing inside. But it was significantly cheaper than the others, but I knew a lot of the content was still intact, so I was able to read a lot of the articles and kind of get a feel for the magazine in the early 70s at least. Table of contents. So even just reading the articles inside, the topics are very interesting. Included are articles about being the other woman, what the female orgasm is, what it felt like to grow up fat, which I'm going to talk about this article a little bit because reading it really got me. It's called Confessions of a Formerly Fat Girl, and in it, Suzanne Levine describes the feeling of always being watched while eating, knowing that she was different from her peers, and being told that constantly. And she also talks about how when she lost the weight as an adult, she felt a lot of distrust when people would become close to her or compliment her. She describes how being seen and being wanted was so intoxicating that she would be so grateful for that attention and end up being treated like a doormat. The ending of the article is about how the guy she ended up marrying had initially gone on a terrible date with her when she was fat, and after meeting her again when she had lost weight, said, "You're not grotesque anymore." Bitch, he seriously said grotesque. She says that only someone who hasn't experienced an unending flow of compliments about their looks would understand the positive feeling she got from hearing anymore. I'm still stuck on the fact that she married this man. She used this word, apotheosis, to describe how amazing it felt to be at the peak of beauty according to this man. I am apoplectic at the justification of awful behavior and comments towards fat people. Hope you're doing well, Suzanne. Here is another article, this time about being an unwed mother of two in 1971. It's a great perspective, though still limited by the author's privilege and upbringing. Suzanne White, a different Suzanne this time, describes being the black sheep in her traditional upper-middle-class white family. She talks about not letting others pressure her to feel shame about her life. There are also general interest articles on things like migraines and painting your house. This is an example of the short fiction included in Cosmo. This one specifically is about a World War I romance between a Muslim man and a Christian woman. The spelling of Muslim stood out to me here, and when I looked it up I realized I had not been using the correct version of the word as a noun, so. The author of this story is actually uncredited, and Kurban Said is an alias. The book was published in 1937, so this is actually a reprinting of a chapter in the book. I didn't dive too deep into the kind of advertisements that were in Playboy and Playgirl, but they were extremely similar, a lot of alcohol, underwear, cigarette advertisements. However, I do want to show some specific ones here. This one is really funny to me. Look at this cigarette ad. It's only natural. That's pretty funny. The ads in this are crazy. The cigarette ads like this one from Eve Cigarettes are wild to me. Smoke pretty. It's wild because making the cigarette boxes look pretty is not something that companies do today, but when I looked up if it was illegal for them to design a pretty box in the US, the answer wasn't no. In fact, Australia was the first country to have instituted a plain tobacco packaging mandate, where tobacco products are required to display only the brand name and a Surgeon General health warning on the box. 25 countries in total have a plain tobacco packaging mandate, but not the US. This is a dieting ad, or article maybe, advocating the use of stickers to remind yourself to stick to your diet that say shit like, sure, fat people are lovable, but not desirable, and fat makes you look sexless. The beautiful people are thin. The stickers are great. They're insane. I hate these. That's Jesus Christ. This is the same magazine that had an article about how a woman who was bullied for being fat as a kid grew up with a whole host of issues, and yet here we are in the same magazine being like, yeah, but fat people suck, right? Are you serious? The stickers are in this book by Julius Ehick called the Stick to It Diet Book. It's also sad because where you feel that there might be some self-awareness, like in this ad, did your breakfast look like this today? There's also this kind of acceptance that this is the way things are. The copy on this reads, "One of the big reasons for dietary iron deficiency among women today is the way American women eat, or rather, don't eat. According to the experts, 2/3 of women between 13 and 55 have iron-deficient diets. This is America's most widespread nutritional deficiency. You know you need extra iron, nearly twice as much as a man. You lose iron every month, and it's not easy to replace it with the foods you eat, especially when you're dieting or too busy to eat right. That's why you should take one-a-day brand multiple vitamins plus iron every day. So keep dieting and starving yourself or whatever, but just take a couple vitamins." Okay. That isn't to say that a big bust wasn't favored. Trust me, it was a tiny waist and big bust. Fun fact, this Mark Eden bust developer is as phony as it sounds, and the makers were indicted for mail fraud as a result of marketing and selling this product. Hey look, a Sally Hansen ad. Initially, I misread this ad as an ad for the contraceptive pill, but this is actually for contraceptive foam? Never heard of that one before. And this one blows my mind too because it's encouraging women to become programmers. And McGraw-Hill is still a huge textbook publisher. This one just seems straight up unhygienic. Some of these, if you've seen Mad Men, you'll be like, it looks exactly the same, good job. There was one ad in Playboy that I'll have to find it, because when I opened up the Playboy and I saw it, I was like, oh my god, that's the famous Volkswagen ad, calling it a lemon, saying that like, oh, look how teeny tiny this car is. I don't know if you've seen that ad. I will have to explain it better in a second. Just like extremely interesting look into early 70s, right? The cultural trends, what people were interested in, what publications were like. One thing that I've noticed from all three of these magazines within these decades is that they are so long. They're so much longer than articles that are written today in newspapers and magazines, as well as just like longer than I would have expected. I'm not sure, because yes, I've noted again and again these are very thick magazines, but when I first saw how big they were, I assumed it was all ads, right? But even the interviews with celebrities, something that I'd expect to be, let's say, short, medium, very, very long. So there's a lot of thought put into the writing, and it doesn't really seem like they were given like too strict of a word limit, like a word maximum. And I will say this, as annoying as those ads are on articles today that we're scrolling through in the middle of the page that kind of just like take up the whole thing, these ads in the middle of articles are also very annoying, and you have to like flip 6 pages in front to find the rest of the article, right? So they want you to look at more stuff inside. So it's always been a thing, right? And if there's anybody out there like, duh, it's always been a thing, excuse me, this is the first October 1971 Cosmopolitan issue I've ever read. Thank you. I found it. Okay, so in this issue, October 1968, where Ralph Nader was interviewed, I found this Volkswagen ad that was highly discussed at the time of its release. And let me read it to you. So, it says, "Volkswagen doesn't do it again. Beautiful. It's not any longer. It's not any lower. And it's not any wider. The 1969 Volkswagen. 13 improvements. Ugly as ever. Beautiful. Just beautiful." So, for the time, it's a really funny ad and provocative, because who's gonna say, like, that shit about their own car? It's a funny little roast. And I guess this was also right before the 70s when roasts really got big. But yeah, I saw that and I was like, I've seen this ad before. That's so crazy. This is the first time I've ever seen it the original way it was published, right? So that blew my mind a little bit. It really did. I really enjoy being able to encounter these things in their original format, if that makes sense. Reading through a 1968 Playboy or a 1971 Cosmo, it kind of puts me in the mindset of somebody that would have been reading it at that time, because all of the context within it is just about that year, right? Or years prior. I like it. It's going back in time. Anyway, advertisers like Estee Lauder would advertise in Cosmo, at least in this October 1971 issue, and we saw that Estee Lauder was not interested in advertising in Playgirl. So because this is an issue that does not include a nude male centerfold, Estee Lauder might have gone back on that decision in later issues. But Cosmo, as a whole, began in 1886. At inception, Cosmopolitan started off as a family magazine with topics of domestic interests, right? And after it was sold 2 years later, it became a magazine more suited toward literary interests, but did still include a wide range of topics. Cosmo began its life as the Cosmopolitan in 1886 under Schlitt and Field. Paul Schlitt describes the magazine as a first-class family magazine. Circulation only hit 25,000 that year, and by 1888, they had run out of money. This was when it was sold to John Brisbane Walker, who focuses on literary interests and contributes his own articles as well. Walker also turned to selling ads in the magazine to create revenue. In 1897, there were 300,000 Cosmopolitan magazines in circulation. Seeing the kinds of articles that Walker wrote, shown here from the Red Rocks History website, was surprising and completely unlike what the magazine included after the 1990s. This is when Cosmopolitan became an extremely popular American literary magazine, much like something like The Atlantic. In 1905, Cosmopolitan was sold to publishing tycoon William Randolph Hearst. William Hearst was Patty Hearst's grandfather, and Patty Hearst was the daughter of great publishing magnates that robbed a bank with the Symbionese Liberation Army in 1976. In the period between 1905 and 1940, the magazine was known for a bit of muckraking. Love that word. It's basically looking for old tweets to cancel somebody. Something crazy that I read about was that in 1906, Cosmopolitan actually helped pass the 17th Amendment in the United States that allows for popular election of our senators. Before, it wasn't us electing them, but our state legislature. So that's huge. Helen Gurley Brown wrote a book called Sex and the Single Woman in 1962, and this was a bit of a groundbreaking book because sex was not for the single woman, sex was for the married woman. And Helen Gurley Brown became editor-in-chief in 1965, taking the magazine in a totally different direction. Under Helen Gurley Brown, the new motto of Cosmo became fun, fearless, and female. Catchy. For any Playboy historians, you might already be familiar with The Dick Cavett Show, and when Hugh Hefner debated Susan Brown Miller and Sally Kemper. When Hugh Hefner debated Susan Brown Miller and Sally Kempton. Okay. Why did I keep forgetting? Okay. So this interview from The Dick Cavett Show includes an interview with Helen Gurley Brown talking about the nude male centerfold in Cosmopolitan. Now this was before the male centerfold was introduced. Dick Cavett introduces the topic saying that he's heard it's something that's going to happen, and Helen Gurley Brown confirms this and says that she wishes that it hadn't gotten out before she was able to put it in the magazine, right? She said she wanted to surprise people, so that was kind of interesting. But the whole interview was really eye-opening because Helen Gurley Brown is sitting there talking to Dick Cavett, a man that I really don't know. I've only ever seen the clips from the debate with Hugh Hefner and then this one. So there he seemed kind of like playing the straight man, a little neutral, kind of obviously like a man that is a product of his time, not necessarily like a super 100% woman's lib kind of dude either, but clearly by inviting these women and having these discussions on his show, it's not, I believe that he wasn't necessarily opposed to it. Either way, I'm not here to talk about Dick Cavett, but maybe later. Helen Gurley Brown was telling him that she felt attracted to a naked man, and she felt that other women would be attracted by the visual of a naked man. So that's the reasoning behind the male nude centerfold, and that if you understand Playboy's success, then she thinks that you would understand the success of Cosmopolitan and their male nude centerfolds. Now, Dick Cavett was saying that there's evidence that women don't like to see the male nude body, right? And he seemed pretty adamant about his perception that women were not interested in this at all. And I think that that's reflective of the time when evidence of women's sexuality was more evidence of non-sexuality. It was more thought that women were almost asexual in that they don't receive sexual pleasure, but also that that was a good thing. That it was just kind of like, well, sex is pretty much just for baby making when it's you guys, but we enjoy it. And that was just kind of accepted. And I mean, this is, again, it's kind of like the majority view. I'm not saying that everybody felt this way. Anyway, I feel that the idea of men being sexualized to Dick Cavett was terrifying. And that's super interesting because I think in his mind, he knew that sexualization wasn't inherently positive. So the thought of being sexualized as a man, the way that women were in that time, must have been a little scary. So that should maybe that tells you something, right? In 1972, Burt Reynolds becomes the first cosmopolitan man with a nude centerfold. I can find evidence of more nude centerfolds in the 70s and 80s within Cosmo, but I couldn't find an exact year as to when they stopped doing them. If I had to guess, it was before 1990, but it could have been as a result of Helen leaving in 1997. And in February 1976, Beverly Johnson becomes the first black model to be on the cover of Cosmopolitan. Not everyone was down for Cosmopolitan changing hands and taking on kind of a different direction, including Kurt Vonnegut, who had once published within Cosmopolitan before Helen Gurley Brown became editor. This is what Kurt Vonnegut had to say. One monthly that bought several of my stories, Cosmopolitan, now survives as a harrowingly explicit sex manual. A lot of people would agree with that. In fact, I remember growing up and grabbing a hold of one of my sister's Cosmo magazines, and then some extended family members saw me reading it and freaked out on me and like ripped it out of my hands, and they were like, this is disgusting trash. You should never be reading. So that's pretty funny, and I'm not gonna lie, that sounds pretty similar to what the reaction might have been to something like Playboy or Playgirl. And yet, it wasn't necessarily a sexual magazine that included sexual images, at least not in that time either, right? Because I didn't grow up in the 70s or 80s when they had nude centerfolds, right? It was simply the descriptions. Cosmo is still published by the Hearst Corporation in New York. Not wanting to miss out on any part of the market, Cosmopolitan decided to release a men's version in a single issue in 1978 called The Cosmopolitan Man, and again in 1989 with 2 more issues. However, Cosmo, of course, was not without its own controversies. In fact, in 1988, Cosmopolitan posted a factually incorrect and very risky story about how HIV was not a concern for straight women, and that they could not contract HIV through missionary sex, which was untrue, and many researchers, consumers, boycotted Cosmopolitan for spreading that information. In an October 1989 issue, Cosmopolitan decided to release stories about how bisexuality was the bridge to HIV, and was really kind of like anti-bisexuality in their reporting, and again, spreading a lot of harmful misinformation about HIV. And Helen Gurley Brown stepped down as editor-in-chief in 1997 and died in 2012. In 1999, Cosmopolitan released Cosmo Girl, which was intended for a younger female audience, and Cosmo Girl ended in 2008. Also in 2008, the Hearst family experiences some infighting when Victoria Hearst, along with Nicole Wider, claims that Cosmopolitan contains pornography, and this is in an attempt to restrict sales to ages 18 and older. They purchase billboards in Salt Lake City, Utah, Memphis, Tennessee, and Nashville, Tennessee, to say that Cosmopolitan magazine contains pornography that hurts kids, with the website cosmohurtskids.com. Now, Victoria Hearst is Patty Hearst's younger sister. Victoria says that she was called on by the Lord to buy a 10,000 square foot barn and create Praise Him Ministries. See, it's weird because my knee-jerk reaction to a religious group condemning a magazine about sexuality or that includes sexuality is to disagree. But then they said, if it's a magazine for adults, why not sell it to adults? And what they wanted, as stated in their Change.org petition, was for the modesty covers to apply to Cosmo just like they do to Playboy and Hustler, and for them to only be sold to people 18 and older. This isn't an insane request considering the neutral venue of grocery stores, where that's a ground that kids are going to be inevitably. So I started to agree initially, but then I read the comments in support of this Change.org petition, and it struck me that Cosmopolitan is bad in the same way that Playboy is bad, but there's an attribution error where the religious right seemed to identify all sexuality and sexual content to be bad and evil, with no discerning lens. While I can agree to put a modesty cover over a Cosmo in a supermarket, it's not because all sex and sexual content unordained by straight marriage is bad. But some of these Change.org petition comments really resonated with me. Like this one saying that I don't want young women to think they need to be sexy to be loved. That's an amazing point. I completely agree. And yet, the other comments are about how sex is evil and no sexual content should be sold, ever, and sex is only for marriage. Like, bro, no, you lost me there. Yes, the magazine could be restrictively sold to those over 18, and that is a measure that was not previously put in place. However, the goal of the religious right was not simply one magazine in one context, and the people in support of this petition weren't talking about modesty covers alone. They didn't want Cosmo sold on supermarkets at all. And they didn't want Cosmo sold at all, and they didn't want sexual content or whatever they deem pornography to be available at all. This environment creates the kind of sneaky and uninformed excursions into sex and sexuality where minors are curious about the topics, but they've never been taught any of that, and conversation surrounding it is forbidden. The Journal of Adolescent Health released a study concluding that abstinence-only education has been a failure in the United States. It only increased negative associations with sex and sexuality, as well as the chances of negative health outcomes as a result of the total lack of education. Now, discerning audiences like you and me can see that Cosmopolitan magazine can be harmful to women, especially young women. But that doesn't mean that Cosmo, or Playboy, are the only possible platforms for discussions of sexuality. And they shouldn't be. And when people remark that advertisers prey on women's insecurities, that applies to kids as well as adults. Cosmo has had some really negative content, but if the response to Cosmo and magazines like it is, it's simply disgusting explicit porn, and then offering no other more suitable resources for sex and sexuality discussions, leaves kids with unanswered questions and a really tempting taboo. I think what's dangerous, in addition to the mentality that all discussions of sex are bad, is that when a minor picks up a Cosmo and reads it, and finds out that it's not literally Hustler or Playboy, they're going to question the other forbidden items and the validity of their parents' judgment. That lack of nuance is harmful, and there are no strict definitions of softcore pornography or hardcore pornography, and when it comes to groups like the religious right, softcore, hardcore, it's all the same. The religious right and organizations like this use these cases that are smaller where people might reasonably agree and blow them up. They conflate drag queen library readings with indoctrination and pornography. Because their goal wasn't a modesty cover on a magazine, it was to prevent discussions of sex, period. And really it's about control. There's a Christo-fascist agenda behind many of these movements that is barreling into Gilead with zero irony. But I'll say this, Cosmo as a magazine needs to get its shit together or die already because these articles are literally garbage, and it's a dying medium. Like, they want you to subscribe to their online backlog of articles that are all written like an unhinged Facebook post. At one point, the magazine really wanted to be the first to do something. They wanted to be beneficial to women. They wanted to be groundbreaking. And there were moments in history where it was breaking new ground. But magazines sold less and less with every year, and the medium of print publication was too expensive and too unpopular to be anything but ridiculously speculative, head-turning, or jaw-dropping. With this came titles in all caps all over the covers saying things like, "How not to gain pounds during a pig out," "Easy money, 4 ways to get cash fast," and "Kinky sex moves." From the 2010s on to today, Cosmopolitan is known for their articles. They're terrible articles. Their advice ranges from not so bad to just plain illegal. Maybe at some point Cosmopolitan cared about the quality of their articles, but after that tipping point, and likely in relation to declining sales, topics for articles shifted exclusively to sex, and more than that, sex tips in some kind of listicle format. The magazine includes letters to the editor and sex questions from women to the magazine, and those things were an insight into how a magazine like Cosmo could talk about women and sexuality and exploring sexuality, right? And how beneficial that would be. I live in the US, where sex education is not guaranteed in every state or school and is banned often in favor of abstinence-only education. The internet is teaching a lot of young people about sex and sexuality because that's where they can get answers when their parents tell them that it's a forbidden or taboo topic. And what does come up in searches about sex is stuff like Cosmo articles, porn sites, and content that makes money based on how many people click on it, instead of content that's intended to educate. This is especially true for young LGBTQ kids who are scared to even talk to other people about their feelings and their questions. Now it's 2018, and Jonathan Van Ness, Laverne Cox, and RuPaul all get their own Cosmo covers, but not in Cosmopolitan US. only in Cosmo UK and Cosmo South Africa. I've been focusing on Cosmo US exclusively for this video, but when I came across these historic covers, I wanted to talk about them. In fact, I looked to see if Laverne Cox, JVN, or RuPaul had gotten a Cosmo US cover, and there were none. Now, Cosmopolitan has 64 editions worldwide that have their own editors that make their own versions of the magazine. But I think it's weird that Cosmo would do something like celebrate super hard having a trans model on the cover, only to limit that cover to one international edition and no US covers. It feels weird to count that as some kind of historic representation when it's pretty underhanded to only make an effort for diversity and inclusion in editions of Cosmo with a smaller audience. Now, all magazines moving forward had to find a new sustainable way to make profit and to grow with their audience, right? To grow with the times. And everything was moving towards digital versions of a magazine, right? So beyond creating a website, today Cosmopolitan gets a ton of views on Snapchat, around 3 million a day, which is a different metric than circulation numbers and certainly less in revenue for the magazine, but in terms of eyeballs, the magazine still has a recognizable brand. They're doing pretty well there. The brand, however, is synonymous with a tabloid for the kind of advice and journalism given. And again, while there are no more nude male centerfolds within Cosmopolitan, their covers, as well as the writing within, have been censored by stores. So just like Playboy had to cover up their magazine cover when it was sold on shelves, Cosmopolitan has to do the same thing. And in 2018, Walmart decided to remove Cosmopolitan from their stores after some encouragement by religious organizations. It's really interesting to me that Cosmopolitan is a much less explicit magazine, in my opinion, than something like Playboy, and yet they had very similar reactions from stores, from general audiences, from religious groups, where they thought it was too sexually explicit, that it was harmful to children, and that it shouldn't be sold in stores. So it is extremely interesting how, again, this one is targeted towards women. It is still too sexually explicit despite the content of the magazine not being visual necessarily, and I find that the criticism against it is just as strong as something like Playboy. Now, I don't know if that's fair or not, but I do know that having seen Cosmopolitan growing up, like, ooh, have they made some mistakes? And some of the things that they've said, some of their whole get a man shtick and the, like, specific, sexual advice that they give, it's been bullshit too, right? I mean, I think that all these kinds of magazines where they talk to you about your sexuality, but in a way where they're attempting to promote like trends in sexuality or attempting to tell you what the opposite sex likes, it's kind of falling into a trap, right? There's a lot of generalizations, and also the people publishing will definitely have their own biases, their own opinions, and are really talking about themselves when they publish. So something so subjective will always have criticisms, but I was surprised to find that there was a time when Cosmo was very different, very different, right? Pre-Helen Gurley Brown, during Helen Gurley Brown, and certainly after she left. This isn't even a magazine that, while it's still being published, I don't buy it, right? My sister, I mentioned that she had a copy once. I didn't see her buy it that often either. If I had to guess, I would say it was certainly more popular in the years prior to 2000 than it was, or than it has been since. Thank you for watching. I hope that you learned something new, that something piqued your interest. I certainly keep finding out new things when I'm researching one topic, and I end up finding things out about like 5 more. So, one last thing. I really enjoyed finding these old covers because the way that they evolve is really cool. I think that the design totally changed, and it says something about the era in which they were printed and also the audience they were trying to attract. So I put together kind of a chronological evolution of the magazine's cover by decade. Something of note from 1965 to 1995, the same photographer, Francesco Scavullo, shot all of the Cosmopolitan covers. If you currently read Cosmopolitan, or maybe you used to and don't anymore, I would love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for watching!